Hello, this lecture is on the Civil War. It's a little bit of a long one because the Civil War is obviously a huge topic. It was the biggest war in American history and arguably the most important one. The first states to secede did so after the 1860 election, but before Lincoln even took office. South Carolina was first in December of 1860 and was followed shortly thereafter by the Deep South states of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia, as well as Texas and Florida. So basically, the states that were most dependent on slavery were the first ones to secede, and all did so before Lincoln was even sworn in as president. Lincoln was not specifically named in most of their declarations of secession, but his election was the final cause, and they kind of indirectly allude to the fact that a new president had been elected who is against slavery throughout those documents. They just don't specifically use his name. So really, Lincoln's election is kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, or whatever metaphor you want to use, final nail in the coffin. This is something that had been coming for a long time, as we've discussed for weeks now, but this is the kind of immediate spark that sets everything off that's been building up. In February of 1861, the states that had already seceded established the Confederate States of America. Within a few months, also Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy. These states were less dependent on slavery by this time in history and were therefore slightly more reluctant to secede. And during the war, the people in these states were divided somewhat. Some fought for the Union, others for the Confederacy, and most of these states that joined later were kind of more divided in their loyalty. So kind of had people on both sides, whereas the first states that seceded, most of those were more uniformly Confederate, although there was still Union loyalists even in those states. We'll talk a little bit about that. The Confederacy elected Jefferson Davis as its president. He was a West Point graduate and had been Secretary of War before, so he had a solid military background, which is probably going to be helpful. Although, as it turned out, that wasn't really what the Confederacy needed. Davis, he was president, but he wanted to be out on the front lines and fighting, and he wasn't really all that great with the tricky task of keeping his new nation united and working together. That's what the Confederacy really needed, as a leader that held them together, kept them driving towards a common purpose. And Davis wasn't very good at that, and the way the Confederacy was set up didn't really encourage that either. The Confederacy's government was kind of in between the United States Articles of Confederation that we talked about after the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution. So it had a central government and a president, but that central government was still fairly weak. So it's a little bit stronger than the Articles of Confederation, but it's not nearly as strong of a national government as the United States has with the Constitution. Most of the power under the Articles of Confederation belonged to the individual states that made up it. Declaration of Secession from Texas that I read you in the last lecture on the lead up to the Civil War kind of explained that they were very explicit, considering that the states were independent entities, that they were the ones that had the power. But many parts of the Confederacy's Constitution was borrowed word for word from the U.S. Constitution. And the most obvious difference was that slavery was explicitly put into the Confederate Constitution and protected by it, unlike the U.S. Constitution, which only indirectly refers to slavery. The most direct reference to slavery in the U.S. Constitution was that 3/5 compromise, and that's still kind of an indirect saying, oh yeah, there's slavery and it might affect some other things. But there's nothing explicit in the U.S. Constitution saying, yes, slavery is legal or anything like that. Whereas the Confederacy, definitely, they make that explicit. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, so after the formation of the Confederacy, but before some of the states had seceded. he tried to reassure the slave states that had not yet left the Union that he would not interfere with slavery where it existed. He said he had, quote, no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. So he said that in his inauguration. He said, I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. So he doesn't believe it's legal for the president to abolish slavery nationwide, and he doesn't want to. He doesn't think that's a good idea to try to, in a political sense or in a lot of other senses as well. He said that the Union would continue to hold and occupy federal property. So he reaffirmed that the view that the Union was permanent and that secession was not permittable, and that he's kind of giving a little bit of a carrot, or trying to at least saying, okay, I'll protect slavery in the states that it exists already, but on the other hand, if you do go through with seceding, I will not tolerate that. So he said that he would continue to hold any federal property like military forts or arsenals, weapon stores and things like that, even if they are in southern states that had seceded already. And Lincoln said the U.S. military would defend those spots if the Confederacy tried to take over any federal property that existed in the South. The Union would not fire first, though, but would treat any attack on these Union facilities as an act of rebellion that would be met with military force. So he's giving the South a choice. If you're serious about secession, you will have to fight for it. He won't just let the South go without a fight. He's saying if you want to secede, there will be a war for it, that you need to win the war in order to secede. For his closing, which he knew was in many ways the last message before this looming war, his closing remarks in his inaugural address, he said, quote, I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passions may have strained it, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. As stirring as those words were, and something that's widely quoted, one of Lincoln's most famous phrases from probably our most eloquent president ever. As stirring as his words were, they weren't enough to prevent more secessions, although he maybe did prevent some of the border states from seceding with his reassurances. And it certainly did not bring the two sides to a new compromise that would avert war. The division of the United States had become too deep and too passionately felt for that kind of compromise to happen without serious bloodshed and kind of carnage to make one side realize, or maybe both sides realize, what this division has caused. In April of 1861, the war started. At Fort Sumter, so a U.S. military fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate forces fired on the Union-held fort that was protecting the harbor before, and now it's still being held by the Union. Confederates want to take it over, so they fire on it. The fort, the Union commander surrenders because the fort was low on supplies. It had been surrounded by the Confederates for months already and kind of cut off from supplies. So it wasn't much of a battle, but it was the first shots that were fired, and it showed clearly that war was coming, that there was neither side was very interested in averting this war if it meant giving in on what they believed was most important, which for Lincoln and the Union is preserving the Union, and for the South, it's preserving slavery. This raised the stakes of secession, so some of the wavering slave states that had not yet seceded declined to do so. These are the so-called border states. So Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware all still had legal slavery, and Lincoln had assured them that it would remain legal. But it was, these states had slavery, but it was much less important to these states. than the ones that had seceded already. So they had some slaves, but it wasn't central to their society or their economy. So they decided it's not worth seceding over the issue of slavery. So with Lincoln's promises to preserve slavery in the states that existed, these states decided to stay in the Union, and they got to keep slavery, at least for the time being. Some of their citizens did side with the Confederacy and fight for it, though. On the other hand, some, as I kind of mentioned, some people in the Confederate states, or some of the Confederate states, had significant numbers of people who stayed loyal to the Union and fought for the Union. So this was especially true in the Confederate states of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. Had many people who remained loyal to the Union, and including many that volunteered to fight for the Union. Virginia had so many loyalists in its Appalachian Mountain area that the state of West Virginia was carved out and formed from Virginia and was admitted to the Union as a new state for the Union that would not have slavery, it continued to have slavery, but it stayed loyal to the Union, but it got to keep slavery for a while. So this is West Virginia is another border state, even though it wasn't a state before the war began, and this kind of becomes a state because there's so many Union loyalists there. Even in the very slave-dependent states, though, there were still Unionists who could be found. Usually these were people who were ethnically different than the majority of the population in these states, or possibly immigrant populations who did not want slavery around. So in Texas, for example, Texas is a very slave-dependent state that's very pro-slavery and is one of the first to secede and join the Confederacy. But in the Texas Hill Country, you had many German immigrants who were in favor of the Union, that they had recently immigrated from Germany, and they came for land. They didn't come to have slaves. They came to have their own land and farm it, and so they don't like slavery, and they're ethnically different than the Anglo-Americans around them, so they mostly sided with the Union and were kind of a thorn in the side of the Confederates in Texas. So when people talk about the Confederacy as some kind of heritage of the South, keep in mind that many Southerners were not united behind the Confederacy, and many opposed it. In fact, guerrilla warfare by Southern Unionists and Confederate deserters against the Confederacy was one of the main reasons why the Confederacy did not prevail. So the South was not united behind the cause of the Confederacy, and that's a huge reason why the Confederacy did not succeed, is because many people remained loyal to the Union. This is something that gets overlooked by a lot of people, but it's incredibly important in turning the war against the Confederacy in the long run. And of course, if we're talking about the Confederacy and as some kind of heritage, keep in mind also that 1/3 of the population in the Confederate States of America were slaves, and obviously they did not appreciate what the Confederacy stood for, which was explicitly defending the institution that kept them in bondage. So Confederacy is, the Union has its divisions as well. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But in terms of the overall war cause, the Confederacy maybe has deeper divisions than exist in the Union. That's an important disadvantage for the Confederacy, and one that a lot of people forget about. The advantages and disadvantages of both sides. So each side had their own advantages and disadvantages in this war. The North, so advantages for the North, it had a much larger population to draw from. So it had about 22 million people versus about 9 million people in the South, of whom 3.5 million were slaves. So the Confederacy just has a much larger population to draw from. It had about a 4-to-1 advantage in white military-age men compared to the South. So at the beginning of the war, the Union was not permitting African Americans to fight for it, so it was only white men who could fight for it. So the Union has about 4 times as many people that it can potentially draw from than the South does. And that would change because the Union would eventually permit African Americans as well to participate and fight for the Union. The North also had far more industry and a more balanced economy, so it had all the essentials it needed for war. It had railroads to distribute the supplies and to move its armies quickly, all that sort of stuff. One thing I want to point out is that there's often a portrayal of so the South was agrarian and they're all farmers, and so therefore they're all really good at shooting and stuff like that. And the North are all, it's industrialized, so they're all from the city and they don't know how to shoot and stuff like that. Not true. The majority of so it's true that the vast majority of Southern soldiers had been, farmers before the war, and were maybe, pretty well acquainted with firearms and things like that. But in the North, even though the North is more industrialized and has industry, it's still, the majority of the population is still living in rural areas and are agricultural. So it's a smaller percentage. It's not as big of a majority of the people that are of the Union soldiers who were farmers before the war, but it's still a majority of Union soldiers had lived on farms, were probably familiar with firearms and all that before the war. So there's less of a difference there than a lot of people sometimes perceive there to be. Both sides, the majority of the soldiers have been farmers in the past and came from rural areas. So the Union has industry, much more so than the South, but that doesn't mean, the North at this point is not all big cities and is not primarily industrial yet. It just has significantly more industry than the South does, which is a big advantage. The U.S. government also had the organization and capacity to support a large army, and it expanded those capabilities during the war. So the IRS and the first income tax and the first national paper money were all created by the United States government to pay for the war, whereas the Confederacy had hardly no taxes to raise money. It had worthless paper money because who is going to trust that paper money is going to be good in the long run from this rebel government? And it had no ability to get loans or credit because, once again, who's going to trust that this rebel government is going to be able to pay you back in the long run? So the Confederacy, just like the United States during the American Revolution, the Confederacy didn't have any real way to finance this war, which resulted in a lot of problems. The Union had an existing organized government with good political leadership, so Lincoln was obviously brilliant. I would say hands down the best president in American history. The challenges he faced and his ability to rise to those challenges are unparalleled, even by the likes of George Washington or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Lincoln also had a great ability to see the big picture and balance the conflicting needs of the war. So he's got political forces acting on him in different ways, and he's very good at kind of balancing those political forces and keeping all sides happy in order to keep moving towards his goal of reuniting the Union. The Union had also retained almost all of the U.S. Navy. And most of the organization of the U.S. Army, although many very experienced U.S. Army officers had came from the South before and went over to side with the South, although there were Southern, people who were native Southerners who stayed loyal to the Union and stayed in the U.S. Army. There was lots of those people. Again, the Confederacy was much less united than people commonly assume. So the Union had almost all of the U.S. Navy, though. The U.S. Navy did not. It had been made up, staffed. Most of the personnel had came from the North before, because the North is where most of America's major ports were. So most of the U.S. Navy remains loyal, and that's a big advantage for the Union. The North had some disadvantages, though, so getting the Northern public to support and continue supporting the war was not always easy. So the Democratic Party in the North continued to function and exist, although it was vastly outnumbered by the Republican Party after the Confederacy leaves. But the Democratic Party in the North mostly opposed the war and wanted to negotiate a peace, even if that meant leaving a divided United States. So these Northern Democrats are sometimes labeled the Copperheads, as kind of a nickname for these Northern Democrats who want peace, no matter how much that costs the United States in the long run. The draft to get soldiers into the Union Army was especially unpopular, and there were riots about it. So that was something that, a lot of people were upset about the draft and their sons or themselves having to be, being forced to serve in the military and risk their lives to try to bring the South back into the Union. So in general, the North supported the war, but there's things that are potentially leading that support to decline. The biggest disadvantage for the Union, though, was that the Union had to go on the offensive. It had to force the South to give up. Kind of the same situation as the American Revolution with the Americans and the British. The British had to force the Americans to give up their rebellion and to force them to fall back in line, whereas the Americans just had to survive until the British gave up. Same thing. The Union has to force the South to give up its cause, force it to reintegrate with the Union and the United States, whereas the South can kind of just defend itself and hope that eventually the Union gives up. There was also the danger that if European countries diplomatically recognized the Confederacy as independent, then the Union would be forced to abandon the war or risk some kind of outside interference. So just like the American Revolution, that the thing that really turns the tide is the French deciding, okay, the Americans are legitimate and we are going to help them against the British. There was that danger that maybe the British or the French or another powerful European country would say, okay, we recognize the Confederacy and we're going to start helping the Confederacy. That would basically mean the Union lost. So that was a very real danger. Although it was a little bit, a major thing that prevented it from happening was that European countries were very opposed to slavery by this point, so they were very opposed to the Confederacy's cause and very dubious about it because of that kind of moral factor. The South's biggest advantage was, like the American Revolution, the Confederacy just had to hold on long enough. And it could do so while fighting defensively on its own land, although that could be a disadvantage too. So the South faced a lot of devastation from the war being fought within the South, which eventually slowed down the South's ability to support its war effort, with the war, wreaking havoc throughout the South rather than being fought in the North and destroying Northern territory. The defensive nature of the South's war effort also made it more motivating to Southern soldiers, who were often fighting in their home states clearly to defend their homes. So, as I mentioned, kind of personal motivations are often more important for soldiers, and Southern soldiers had that more clearly, that there's a Union Army in their state, and so therefore they're protecting their home territory, no matter what the political causes of this war were. The South had massive disadvantages, though. So the weakness of its government and its internal divisions were huge. While Union victories like Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Battle of Shiloh were very important in the Union's eventual victory in this war, overall, what really stopped Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army was its lack of supplies and men. Men that had not only been killed in battle, but many had deserted or refused to volunteer or to be drafted, or had even joined Union forces and fought against the Confederacy. And the South just runs out of replacements, that they can't continue the war because of the Confederacy's weakness more than Union victories. The Union victories were important, but it's really, as I mentioned, it's the internal divisions and weaknesses of the Confederacy was really never a government that was capable of standing up to this kind of challenge of the Civil War. The South's lack of industry also exacerbated that. The South lacked the transportation for places like Texas to help much with places where, most of the most crucial fighting was occurring in Virginia, because Virginia, there's the Confederate capital was in Virginia. Washington, D.C. is right next door. So the Union capital is right next door. So Virginia was the most important theater. And how is Texas supposed to help Virginia? There's no railroads connecting it, or hardly any, and the Union is able to cut those off. So at the very beginning of the war, Texas sends soldiers to other places, but after a while, places like Texas cannot really assist the rest of the Confederacy, either with sending more men or sending supplies or anything like that. So that's a huge disadvantage. And the South just plain can't produce enough guns, clothing, or supplies for its army. And it couldn't produce enough food for its army or even its civilian population. So Southern civilians suffered tremendously during the war, from lack of food, lack of shelter, and things like that, because the entire Confederate economy and society basically starts to break down by the end of the war because of their own weaknesses, and the Union continues to exploit that weakness and put pressure on the Confederacy kind of where it hurts and where they're vulnerable. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. The Confederacy also had very poor political leadership. So despite it had very good military leadership with the likes of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. So a lot of the best military commanders during the Civil War, the top generals, most capable generals were found on the Southern side. But politically, there's no organized political parties kind of keeping a really coherent policy together. The states bickered with each other, so the byproduct of giving more independence and power to the states and less to the central government was that it reignited all of these kind of minor arguments between states. That's why the Articles of Confederation, why the United States had gotten rid of that in the first place, and now the Confederacy has that kind of bickering and kind of counterproductive arguments amongst itself in the middle of a war. That's not very good. It has President Jefferson Davis, who's not very good at mediating these conflicts. It has political leadership that was very inflexible and unrealistic, that they were basically ideologues. So these were, the fire eaters who were so extreme in their views of protecting slavery that they, wanted to try to expand slavery to the North, that sort of thing. They're the ones who are calling the shots. They're the ones who had pushed for secession, and they're the ones who control the Confederate governments. And they're completely inflexible in their beliefs and what they're willing to do. So that's, like I said, they give the states all the power in this government when this situation of this war really demands a strong central government. No matter what your ideological beliefs are, at least temporarily, they needed something that's more capable of organizing their war effort. They never implement that because their ideology is what's driving their decisions rather than what makes sense. Lastly, slavery was a massive disadvantage for the Confederacy. I know some of you, hopefully not some of you, but I know some people might kind of wonder, well, doesn't having people who do all the work for you mean that more people could fight? Doesn't that mean kind of free up people to fight? Initially, that was a little bit the case, that slavery did enable the South to more completely mobilize its Southern white male, the white male population of the South. And that was the South's hope, is that throughout the war, okay, so, we just leave one or two people behind at the plantations, the slaves can continue to grow everything that we need, and all the rest of the white men will go away to fight. But that wasn't really the reality in the long run. So once white men left to go and fight the war, that meant that slaves became increasingly rebellious and hard to control. Many ran away during the war. Thousands upon thousands run away during the war. Many of these runaway slaves ran to the Union Army. And after some debates over what to do with them, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, Lincoln did not initially want to scare the border states, by ending slavery or having slaves fight for the Union Army. But eventually the Union did allow them to fight in the Union Army. So these, 3.5 million slaves become a source of manpower for the Union, which already had a huge advantage in manpower. By the end of the war, over 179,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. Some of these were free blacks from the North, but most were former slaves from the South. Okay, I'm going to pause here. We're going to break this into 3 parts because it's pretty long, because the Civil War is a pretty big topic. In part 2, I'm going to cover the early part of the war, and then in part 3, I'll talk about the end of the war, kind of the last full measures of the war. Okay, so I'll see you then.